Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ian McCullough. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager for Turnitin's United States and Canada K-12 business. Several weeks ago, we had the pleasure of looking at a session with Staten Island Technical High School in New York City on their journey to become more focused and better employ mastery-based learning principles. And we had such a positive response to that session and the content that they shared that we decided to follow up, and we connected with the Mastery Collaborative, also New York City Department of Education, to try and level up this conversation and give people who are interested in the topic an even broader set of principles so that you all as an audience can know what you can do to make your school more mastery and competency focused, and how you can transform your classroom in a way that other schools have been successful. So with that, it is my pleasure to welcome Joy Nolan and Ashley Ferrara and Meg Stentz. Joy and Meg are from the Mastery Collaborative, and Ashley is at a Mastery Collaborative member school who is an active practitioner. I'm going to hand the baton over to them to take us through the 5 key shifts, or the 5 power shifts that you all can start considering and start exploring. With that, Joy, I hand it over to you.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be with you today, and a big hats off to any educator who, in the middle of the amazing complexity of restarting school, either right now in some places or in the coming weeks in many other places, are taking time to be together today to think about how to do school in a way that is student-centered and does justice to young people, which is going to be a really complicated year. And some folks would think that using a mastery approach or a culturally responsive and sustaining approach would be something extra that they don't have time for now. And we, of course, beg to differ and really feel like it's a super important way to actually accomplish and achieve exactly what we're all trying to do, which is serve young people as well as we can. So I'm going to share my screen. So, hey everyone, I'm Joy with the Mastery Collaborative from New York City. We are actually part of the New York City Department of Education. We are beginning now our 6th year as a community of schools that is focused on mastery-based, culturally responsive, and sustaining education practices. It is a very youth-centered and teacher-focused set of shifts that involves school culture and academics, and has a very strong racial justice and equity focus. I want to turn over to Meg to introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Meg Stentz. I'm the Associate Director of the Mastery Collaborative. And today I'll primarily be hanging out in the chat box to answer your questions and share with you the awesome wisdom that I've learned from our huge community of schools in New York City. Here today, one of our teachers with us, Ashley Ferrara.
Hi everyone, my name is Ashley Ferrara. I'm entering my 9th year teaching. I'm a founding staff member at the Academy for Software Engineering, which is in Union Square in New York City. And I am a math teacher. I've taught algebra, college math, personal finance, and I'm also the instructional coach. And I'm entering my 5th year in full-on mastery-based learning.
Nice, thank you everyone. What we're doing today is getting an intro to the Mastery Collaborative, identifying ways in which mastery-based and culturally responsive shifts can really change the game, especially in remote or blended learning during a global pandemic, and hopefully be very responsive to you about what you're wondering about. So we are not going through this whole giant list of questions, but I do encourage everyone here to grab the slide deck and come back to this list of questions and start thinking through some of these things. These are some questions that we think about and talk about in our community of 70 schools in New York City. And So here are some just really lot of food for thought for you. We don't have time to get into each one of these things. These may be some questions that you have, but these are questions from us to you about how you're thinking about teaching and learning as we head into what is bound to be a very complicated school year. So a little bit about the Mastery Collaborative itself. We are, as I said earlier, part of New York City Department of Education. So we love working in public schools with public schools. We have a beautiful community of, right now, 70 schools. We just welcomed 16 new schools into our program, so we're really excited. This year we'll be working with elementary schools for the first time. We've been working with middle and high schools for 5 years, starting our 6th now. And we work on mastery-based and culturally responsive and sustaining approaches to working with young people. The places where we dig into conversation and practice shifts are around a youth-centered, responsive school culture. So we talk about, for example, what are the power dynamics between adults and young people in your building? We talk about curriculum, design, and implementation, classroom moves, grading practices, and modes of collaboration for young people and adults and the whole staff. We always like to say that mastery gets a lot of deserved attention, but it's our collaborative nature that is our superpower as a community. So just a quick snapshot of mastery across the United States. Most every state is involved in a shift to competency-based education, also known as mastery-based education. Most of us use those as synonyms. It's happening basically in every state. And so you may find your state here and see the red states are statewide systems. The green states are developing. The gold states are emerging, meaning there is some stuff happening there, but there are no statewide initiatives. And then, so you see that almost entirely across the United States, mastery-based learning is happening. What makes the Mastery Collaborative in New York City perhaps unique is that we also infuse culturally responsive and sustaining practices with our mastery practices. And the reason for that is because we have students and teachers from all different ethnicities and racial identities and overlapping intersectional identities. And it's almost impossible to be truly youth-centered unless you are centering the youth who are in your classroom, which requires some specific skills, especially since much of our teaching force is white and many of our students are students of color from a variety of cultures. So what is mastery-based teaching and learning? It is centered around learning outcomes. It uses certain principles like transparency with young people. So you're not just sharing a worksheet or a task with young people. You're actually making really explicit, here's the skill you're learning. Here is why we're doing this. Here's the larger purpose and here's the game plan for that. Here's what success will look like. Here's a rubric that you can use as a learning tool and as sort of a roadmap for your learning over time as your mastery builds. And so transparency is a huge value. It's really based around learning outcomes. Once you have student-friendly learning outcomes that are used as the basis for all your lessons, all your units, all your assessments, the feedback and coaching that you give to young people, the peer feedback that young people are giving to one another. So it's almost like the DNA for everything that's happening in your class. All criteria and expectations are shared from the start. We think this is an equity move because it's always true that there are those students who mysteriously know how to do school. And there are meta studies over the decades that show that the students that get the highest grades are those students who sort of have that magical inside track that if you don't have it, it can just feel like super puzzling. And that's often based on inequities that are happening in a community, from household to household and whatnot. So we want to make sure that there isn't a secret path to success, that everything is laid out and that everyone has equal access to all the expectations, what success looks like, and what all the criteria are. Feedback and coaching gives next steps to young people about how to improve. We're not huge fans of letter and number grades. Those work really well for a certain large minority of students. And the students for whom those do work have their antenna very closely attuned to their grades. So even those students who are very engaged in school are sometimes doing learning in order to sort of like get the next accolade or jump through the next hoop. So we de-emphasize letter and number grades and are much more focused on feedback and actionable next steps. So glows and grows and your next step for yourself to move ahead and improve your mastery. And then assessments are opportunities to demonstrate mastery in multiple varied ways over time. That over time piece is very important because assessments should never be that kind of like walk the plank, one and done kind of thing. Learning is a process, it's a journey, it happens over time. And young people's mastery will improve, their muscles will build, and their capacities will get stronger, and they can show you over time that they're getting better and show themselves over time that they're getting better. So what looks different in a mastery-based school? You'll see in the top slide, it isn't super obvious, like the teacher's not at the front. You can't sometimes find the teacher when you walk into a mastery classroom. The students are working with one another. The teacher is not driving instruction. Grades function as feedback. You'll see this grading scale, NAME, not yet mastery, approaching mastery, meeting mastery, and exceeding mastery, NAME. So can you name your grade? And dividing grades into larger chunks rather than like you got an 87 and I got an 86, so you're better than me. Is that really that meaningful? Having these like broader grading categories helps young people have an idea of where they are and not be focused on the sort of rat race ideas around learning. And you'll see on the right, the Mastery Retake Center repurposing one of those shoe things in your closet as a retake system where young people can choose to improve and get a mastery upgrade or just build their strength at a given learning outcome or two. Many of our schools actually have Mastery Improvement Day or Mastery Upgrade Day, where young people can look back and say, I need to get stronger at this, maybe conference with the teacher and figure out how to spend that time and have a retake. So here is the big important slide for today, the 5 mastery-based power shifts, the key shifts of mastery-based learning. We have supplied a traditional approach so that you can see it as a contrast against the mastery approach. And I sort of try to describe this set of 5 things as the set of things that all need to be true for a system to be truly mastery-based. So shifting to like animals, if you think about, you're trying to describe a giraffe, it has a long neck, so do many other animals. Brontosaurus has a long neck. It has spots, many other animals have spots. It lives in Africa, so do many other animals. But if you put together all of the qualities of a giraffe, you only have a giraffe. And these 5 shifts are the 5 things that distinguish a mastery-based learning system from a more traditional or just different learning system, because we don't want to even pretend that learning is happening in a traditional way. We know that there's all kinds of innovations sort of bursting out in many different areas across the country. So in certain ways, this gray left side is a straw dog, because there are very few truly traditional approach schools, but this is just sort of to give you a contrast between sort of the old way, maybe how you went to school as a young person, as opposed to a mastery system. Just one more thing before I move on to discuss each shift in detail. The 5 shifts we think are each power shifts that shift power to young people while not ceding any power for us grown-ups. So focusing on the first 2 shifts, learning outcomes, that include explicit, measurable, relevant, transferable skills and knowledge, and young people learning and applying both discipline-specific knowledge and those sort of like more general habits and skills and mindsets that underpin success in life, in school, in every class. That is things like critical thinking, goal setting, time management, project management, and also includes things like critical consciousness, the ability to take a critical stance on a societal or community problem and have agency to figure out what to do about that and join forces with others to get that done. So let's look at some learning outcomes. Here are some middle school learning outcomes, one from social studies and one from literacy. You can see that they are student-friendly, not teacher-centered, so they're not those SWABATs. Students will be able to. These are not part of a teacher's lesson. These are on the wall, on the actual task that young people are doing, and are written in a young person's language. Here are some high school disciplines. The ones on the left side are ones Ashley has shared with us from her amazing high school, Academy for Software Engineering. Just to give you an idea of what learning outcomes look like. And some schools use school-wide learning outcomes. So these are from the Young Women's Leadership School of Astoria. They have 10 school-wide outcomes. Here are 6 of them. And all of their classes align to these 10 school-wide outcomes. And you can really hear the young people in that school talking about communicate, be precise, collaborate, and they know where they are in each of those. And it can be very useful for young people to know what argue looks like in a math class as opposed to what it looks like in a social studies class. And there are similarities and differences there that, that are really interesting to note and think about for young people. So what do cross-cutting skills and mindset outcomes look like? Here are some work habits and sort of cross-cutting skills from a couple of our schools, a high school and a middle school. These are the kinds of things we like to say that every teacher hopes that young people show up in your class knowing how to do, but no one feels they have the time to actually do it. Let's think about this third shift. Students receive timely differentiated support. Learning frequently involves collaboration and peer feedback. So you see the young people are engaged with one another here. We want to make sure that young people in remote learning still have the ability to do this. So we are recommending lightly curated opportunities to collaborate, maybe asynchronously. If you think about if your young people are learning remotely, they used to sit together, maybe 4 or 5 kids at a math table and work through a problem together. You can still ask that little small group to still do that, give them a week to figure out a time that works for them all to do it and a reason to rely on and interact with one another. We think that there are a lot of young people who are experiencing stress and isolation, and collaborating with peers is a really great strategy. We want to make sure not to leave that out when we do remote learning. So again, on shift 3, thinking about timely differentiated support, here is a really great idea of a rubric from one of our Living Lab schools, Frank McCourt High School in Manhattan. You can see this rubric has room for glows and grows. You can see that it has a space at the bottom for reflection. And you can use this rubric for peer feedback, or you can use this rubric for self-reflection or for conferencing, even student-led conferences. It looks pretty different from a regular rubric, has less language on it, which is really good for young people for whom language load is an issue. And students are getting personalized glows and grows, learning what they're already good at, which is just as important to know as where they need to improve. So shift 4, assessment is an ongoing dialogue, providing useful, timely feedback, and tends to be a positive learning experience. And that is because we really like to think about assessments that are never that walk the plank one and done, or some folks call it post-mortem assessment, where we do unit 4, take the unit 4 assessment, which everybody freaks out about and crams for, And then even if you got a 70, we're moving on to Unit 5 on Monday with no game plan for making up that 30% of the material that you have not yet mastered. Students in a mastery classroom don't have that tension because they know that they can always revisit, take a retake, upgrade their mastery, and have, even by design, usually about 3 at-bats with any given outcome. So if you're taking an assessment, it's because you're ready to take that assessment. It's in a context where you have time to show that you've improved on that outcome in the future. So you can just hunker down and show where you are right now with those capacities. So here, a project from Brooklyn International and a reflection sheet from another mastery collaborative school. Pacing, the 5th shift. So pacing is responsive and may include reteaching, retaking, extra time, accelerated learning. And so you can see here from 2 different mastery collaborative schools, there are some resources for young people to sort of take the pacing into their own hands and take a retake, get the resources that they might have missed if they were out or need a review. And it's sort of like a dashboard for them to use to take control of the pacing of their own learning to some degree. We have a slightly different take on pacing than some folks who think about mastery as just where you move on to the next thing, and then you move on to the next thing, and you sort of speed your way through. We're really not about, as a field, I would say, we're really not about, this is not a way to speed through, it's a way to go deep and get that genuine transfer. Zaretman talks about becoming independent learners, and that is what we're aiming for here, that young people have a set of capacities that they're taking with them into the rest of their life, into all their classes, into their next level opportunities, whatever those might be, and that they actually hold on to.
We've talked about the practices. What are the barriers for success? Like, as we deal with organizational change, what can people who are going to be advocates for this process expect to encounter, and how can they manage that?
I would say it's about learning and unlearning. So there are practices and mind shifts that you need to master, and that also can entail some unlearning of the old way. And so there needs to be a kind of like between practice and mindset shifts, it needs to be both part of the journey. And if you're focusing too much on the procedural stuff, like, grade less and do it this way, and the educator isn't super clear on the why of that, it can be a challenge. So trying to make sure that you're having those yummy conversations about teaching and learning and why we're doing all of this, as well as focusing on how we're shifting in our classrooms.
I think something that we have, you and I have talked about is really the culturally responsive frameworks. I'd love to kind of step back to that frame as well and talk just about cultural responsiveness and see if we can lay some pieces in there for people who may not have that vocabulary yet.
Okay, so what is culturally responsive education? It is all based on the work of Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, and it is these 3 pillars must be there for culturally responsive education. Students must experience academic success. That sounds like, well, of course, that's what schools are going for, but we have to think about, are all students able to get that exciting feeling of feeling traction and curiosity, and a feeling of like, there's a road in front of me and I'm really curious about a certain aspect of this journey, and I get to choose where I'm going to go deep and how I'm going to use my new capacities and grow those new capacities, and be recognized for what they are able to do, and they're sort of taking a strengths-based approach, not always just focusing on you need 3 more points to pass kind of approach to education. I just want to quickly mention cultural competence, because that's an especially important skill for white teachers working with students of color. It is knowing your own identity and your own perspective, how you may be coming off to the young people in your classroom. Cultural competency is the ability to form meaningful connections and work effectively with others in a way that's not based on similarity to whatever your identity is, however you think of that. So you're working effectively with students from different cultures, young people and colleagues of different intersecting identities, and there are moves you can make to develop that skill. And critical consciousness or socio-political consciousness, which means, again, like being able to diagnose and have a critical eye on a problem, and the agency to band together with others to make a change in the world that you need to make. Go ahead, Meg.
Was about to tell us that we believe at the Mastery Collaborative that all schools are culturally responsive. And we used to work with a colleague, Kalila Brand, who would say this to us and then say that people would like gasp or be surprised. And she would say the evidence is all around us. When we look, we see white students succeeding in schools. So it's up to us as educators to ask ourselves the question of whose culture are schools responding to, and how can we make sure that our classrooms are responding to the students in front of us.
I just want to share that culturally responsive and sustaining education has grown out of Dr. Ladson-Billings' work, but also draws on the work of Geneva Gay, who added the idea of being responsive, not just relevant, and then Django Paris, who brings in the idea of being sustaining of young people's cultural identities, not just being responsive to them. And then I wanted to jump to Ashley and ask how doing this work, combining competency ed or mastery ed, along with culturally responsive and sustaining practices, how does that affect how you interact with young people and how you interact with your colleagues?
So I think on my journey to creating a culturally responsive classroom, I can't do that just talking to myself. My students need to be part of the conversation and the conversation. So something that I started, and this is something, if you're looking to grow into mastery, this is a great first step. I created something called a cogen. If you want to learn more about it, Chris Emden writes all about it in his book, For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood and the Rest of Y'all Too. So basically what a cogen is I took 2 to 3 students from each of my classes and we met regularly. For us, it was bi-weekly. And it's a diverse group of students. It's diverse in race and gender and learning needs. I taught first period every day, so it was diverse in attendance. And you really try to get a really great, well-rounded group. And they are your co-teachers, your co-planners, your co-creators in everything that you do. So I would bring everything to them before it stepped foot into our larger classroom and get their feedback. And I've heard everything from like, I don't like when you say this that way, to let's co-plan this project together, to I don't think that unit should come next. I think this is more responsive to what I need right now. And it was a really, I mean, you need to give students a seat at the table, 100%. And the other thing you need to do, if you're giving students a seat at the table, you need to show them that you're listening to them. So whenever something came up in our cogen that was a change that I was going to make, I would always do it quickly before they forgot that that was the suggestion, and make sure that they knew I was doing it, right? No one wants to give feedback to then see it go into like an abyss of nowhere. And then the third thing, you know, with cogens to think about is like, you need to be really flexible. You need to be flexible with your content. You need to be flexible with your timing. You need to be flexible with the students and with yourself. This is hard, valuable work, but it does require a good amount of flexibility and grace. I think that's kind of a really strong shift that I made into making sure my classroom was responsive and relatable to my students. in terms of where we start with this work, the way I started, I was teaching algebra at the time when I transitioned. I taught algebra in New York State, which means it had a Regents exam, which is basically a state written exam that every student in algebra gets to make sure they learned the right algebra. So I had this big year-end test that could be a gatekeeper to graduation. So there was a decent amount of pressure for me. And what I wanted to do is, I had two hands and I tried to think of the top 10 things I needed students to learn in my class. If I counted all of the state standards that they gave me, I think I would have needed an entire classroom of students of hands because there was that many standards. So I tried to keep it down to 10 and really thinking about if I keep it to my top 10, I then whittled it down to 5 eventually. But if I keep it to my top 10, that is a really great first step in taking your probably state standard focused curriculum down into this mastery focus where you are really transparent with students about what really matters, right? If I was thinking about my year-end state exam and I knew that there was only going to be one question out of the 36 on this thing, it doesn't make sense for me to communicate that one question as important as the content that takes up a quarter of the test. And that's really what mastery helps you do. I'm gonna stop there in time because I can talk about it forever, but that was my first step in transitioning.
That's great, Ashley, thank you. And I just want to share something I heard Zaretta Hammond say last week. If y'all are not familiar with Zaretta Hammond, she has an amazing book called Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain. And she gave the advice last week in this time of remote learning during a pandemic to Marie Kondo your curriculum, to do exactly what Ashley said, cut it down from 10 things to 5 things. Not to say it's not all important, but you really want to be prioritizing. Let's just throw out the window the idea of covering everything. If you're focused on covering everything, you're probably leaving students left behind. And what you really want to do is be taking the pressure off, really teaching the things that matter the very most, as Ashley was just saying, and focusing on students' well-being, your connection with them, their connections with one another, and their deep learning of things they can take with them that will last. Ashley, a teacher had asked, or someone on a participant had asked, how do you get started with this? So I think a couple minutes on that would be time well spent.
Yeah, it's a loaded question. I'm gonna give it a shot. I think when I was teaching algebra, I had all these state standards, and that's when I went down to my top 10. Now I've shifted my practice into really shifting away from content and shifting into transferable skills, which Joyce talked about, and we've shared a couple examples in the learning outcomes. So right now I teach seniors, they're going into the world, and it's really important for me to teach them something that will help them once they leave my room. So my transferable skills right now are things like I can communicate. It goes on more than that. I can communicate, I can create solutions, I can research, I can revise or reflect. And for the record, as an adult, I'm still working on all of those skills and I still stumble. So it's important to understand that the idea of mastering something, like it's not like the traditional learning where I would see someone draw a graph and I'd be like, yep, they did it. Fantastic, moving on. It is this constant evolving process where you continue to bring it back up and resurface it. The biggest shift you'll make in the shift to mastery is that you go from being the person who holds all of the content and knowledge and the teacher, and you go into this coach that gives them repeated cycles of reflection and feedback, and you just keep talking about it because it's something that is always relevant. You don't teach something that's only relevant the last 2 weeks of October because that's when it pops up in your unit.
So Ashley, why don't you tell us about your journey?
Yeah, it feels feels like forever ago, especially during 2020. So when we first transitioned to mastery, I have said this before, I was teaching a course that ended in a state exam. And I felt like every state standard mattered. And I basically tried to make every state standard a mastery skill, which led to a lot of insanity for me and my co-teacher. It was the epitome of a square peg, round hole strategy. It never worked. I had way too many mastery skills, and it was a very hectic year. I took the idea of mastery as I'm just going to take this standard and rename it a mastery skill or a learning outcome. The next year, I really knew that I had to pare down. That's when that top 10 thing came up. And I really tried to think of the top 10 things that I really wanted students to learn. And that proved to be better. It was a low bar, but it was much better for me in terms of planning. And then it gave me additional clarity into the next year where I was still teaching algebra. And I was able to make year-long skills. After a year or two, I was able to take a step back and be like, I don't need to give them an assessment on, I don't need to know if they can graph a line, graph a quadratic equation, graph an absolute value function. I can generalize in, you need to be able to graph using a tool, or you need to be able to model something. And I was really able to pare out the content that was cyclical in algebra. The issue with the state standards is it didn't show me that it was cyclical. It made me feel like every little piece counted, and I needed to take a huge step back and look at the things that I was repeatedly asking my students to do, just with a slightly different format, right? No English teacher talks about, like, they don't talk about your mastery skill being all of book one, right? Like book one, book two, book three, if you're reading all of them, your skill is reading, interpreting, drawing conclusions, and those skills cycle. And the same thing happened for math, but it took me a couple of years to figure out. And now I'm at a point in my career where I'm able to think of these transferable skills like communication and creating solutions, and giving students projects and experiences that help them fish through those real life skills that they will encounter outside of my four walls of my classroom.
Thanks, Ashley. I want to lift up a question that we're seeing in the chat. So an experience that we hear a lot as folks transition is that holding students to mastery is a higher bar in a lot of ways than when we inflate grades with things like participation and effort and homework or completion. And so one of the supports and more equitable shifts that mastery-based grading teachers use is implementing a revision cycle or feedback cycle, or what some of our schools call upgrades. So I was wondering, Ashley, if you could share about revision or feedback cycles at your school and how you support students in making those upgrades.
One thing I want to note is mastery is a shift for us as practitioners of it, but it's also a really big shift for students. So when I first entered into mastery, it was, students weren't used to me being like, here, try again, here, let's make it better, here, let's improve it. They were still used to I'm turning this in, I get this grade, and I never look at it again. So it is definitely a shift in thinking for everyone involved. I can talk about what we did for remote learning, because that may or may not be where many of us are at. So what we do around the shifts and upgrading is we ask for a rough draft. It can get an assessment. It might get like a level of mastery, it might not, but we always give feedback with each specific skill. And then send it back, and it's essentially like a mini project or a week-long assignment or 2 weeks or whatever it needs to be, where there's just this constant going back and forth of feedback. And over the spring, I mean, I can't tell, I got a good number of pings of like, I need to talk about this with you. I don't understand what you said here. Revision remotely is definitely a new process because I'm not here standing next to you pointing and having the dialogue that you're used to. So the shift in the communication between teacher and student when you're going remote is a shift, and a shift that I needed to learn of how to give feedback clearly through a computer. But it definitely still is those cycles. And if you feel like, I don't know, this essay has run its course, right? We're not going to revise it anymore. In mastery that skill will come back. The student knows that they're still going to get to practice this later, that this hasn't died with this one project.
Ashley, that's awesome. And brings me to a conversation I had yesterday with Bronx Collaborative High School, another Mastery Collaborative school. And they were talking about shifting from doing one 10-page research paper to doing 3 shorter research papers because it allowed that cycle to happen. So students were like writing a theme 3 times and finding evidence to support that theme 3 times and thinking through the reasoning that they're using to support their claim 3 times rather than 1 time. And so they ended up with 3 shorter papers and much stronger skills. And a really important shift of mastery is prioritizing the learning experience itself over the sort of like perfect artifact, right? Like the perfect paper or the perfect thing you can hang on your bulletin board or whatnot. It's really about building those skills. And so fantastic. Thank you. Are there other questions, Meg?
We have a question in the chat that is asking about world languages, but I think that what I usually am hearing behind questions around languages, and similarly sort of like math, is balancing the fluency piece. And I think teachers sometimes wonder like what assessments they can still use in a mastery classroom. And so Joy, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like what counts as evidence for mastery and the role of like content fluency versus sort of like mastery of these big skills.
So every content area, every discipline has its own funny mix of skills and knowledge that students need to master. And by knowledge, we're not talking about, stuff you can Google. We're talking about contextualized knowledge, where a student has deep expertise in something that they can share and that will last. I did a big thing about Louisa May Alcott in 5th grade. I could still tell you everything about her. But I couldn't tell you almost anything else I learned from like 1st grade to 12th grade. It's a deep engagement with an area of expertise and building genuine lasting expertise. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about knowledge. I don't love the word content because of that, because content sounds to me like cornflakes. And we're really talking about contextualized knowledge. But a mastery system is very focused around skills. And not low-level skills like can you bring a pencil to class, but can you show your thinking? Can you choose a math strategy that makes the most sense to solve this very complex problem? And so in every discipline, there is a mix of skills and knowledge that are going to show up in your learning outcomes. There's a bit of a hot debate across the country around whether it should be focused only on skills. You'll see that Young Women's Leadership School of Astoria has these 10 skill-based outcomes that their entire teaching and learning from grades 6 through 12 falls under. And there are learning targets that are within each discipline. And this school believes that the knowledge is in the evidence. They always say the knowledge lives in the evidence. So if you're doing a big project about Egypt or quadratic equations or doing an author study, it's actually showing up, you're actually gaining that knowledge, but focusing on the skills.
And if I can just, something that came out during remote learning as well in terms of gathering evidence, what Joy said really reminded me of it, of like, you don't want to assess people on things that they can Google. So for math teachers, like if there are any math teachers on here, we all know about the app where you like hover it over the equation and it like magically does it for you. I think remote learning has pushed us into this area of us needing to be more creative with how we are assessing and getting an idea of where our students are at. And that creativity kind of lends itself naturally into mastery-based assessments. Like, I would much rather, if I was teaching algebra again, have someone videotape themselves speaking me through how they solved a problem versus showing me that X equals 3. And just thinking about, oh, I can accept a verbal submission in a math class as something that counts as evidence. And that is something that I think has pushed a lot of us through remote learning into thinking, because we've had to start kind of reinventing how we assess now that, you know, the tests and the papers can't get handed out.
I just want to go back to the part of Meg's question where she asked about evidence of learning, because that gets at one of our shifts around assessment as a positive experience for young people, rather than that sort of like walk the plank. I have my Unit 4 test tomorrow. The evidence in a mastery classroom is really, it can be a teacher overhears a student explaining a complex topic to a classmate. It can be in a project-based learning situation. It can be a presentation that, like a jigsaw presentation where young people are presenting to one another. It can happen in a conference setting with like a student and teacher in a deep conversation about the outcomes of that unit, and they have a conversation and the teacher sees that the young person really has command of a certain academic skill. It certainly doesn't always have to be a bubble test. And it's really hard to measure skills. Like, it's very hard to measure the skill of supporting your argument effectively with sufficient reasoning and evidence from the Common Core in a bubble test. So we want to think about moving to assessments that really provide opportunities for demonstrating progress and independent mastery of learning outcomes. And that can look so many different ways.
One thing that I'm personally interested in is I'm interested in hearing a little bit about you, Joy, Meg, and Ashley, and how did the Mastery Collaborative get started? What's the history here? Okay,
that's great. So many years ago, I was working with some other colleagues on, we had a grant to do student-centered learning, and it had to do with technology, although technology is not a big part of the Mastery Collaborative at all. We really value, like, you know, teachers and students. But on that grant, we were working with technology, and one of the strands of the grant was around mastery learning. And so we were convening folks to talk about things like blended learning and project-based learning and mastery-based learning, and everywhere, anytime, anywhere learning. So internships and, you know, school that sort of goes beyond the school building. And the one of those strands that got the most sort of energy, and we started getting emails from dozens of teachers at schools all around New York City, was the mastery-based learning strand. And we realized that there were folks doing this in isolation all around the city. So we had one more year of grant funding, and we pitched the idea of spinning off and focusing just on mastery for the last year of the grant. And we were told yes. So we built this community, invited everybody to come and, like, let's learn from each other and see what is the state of mastery in New York City. And as that year was coming to an end, we were told, well, that was great, but your funding is drying up. So thanks, that was really nice. And we said, these were different times, 5 or 6 years ago. We said, but it's such a wonderful community. We're having across these schools, like, amazing success, and, you know, breaking all kinds of barriers with young people who had been reluctant learners who are now super engaged. We found it to be a very strong equity strategy if you use an equity lens. We always like to say mastery can be a more equitable way to do school, but it's really up to us to make it culturally responsive and make it work for all the students in the classroom. I think, like anything, you can't just magically plug it in and make it run and assume that you're going to be dismantling systems of inequity. But there was a shared value around equity, so that was happening across this group of schools. And so we pitched to stick around and keep this community going and growing. And they, at that time, said yes. And now it's a pretty large minority of schools in the New York City area across all 5 boroughs that are taking part in this. It keeps growing bit by bit. And so this year, like I said, we're working with elementary schools for the first time, not because elementary schools are any less fertile ground for mastery, but only because we have a little tiny team and we have to think about bandwidth issues very carefully. But so that's a little bit about how the MC got rolling. And it has grown every year. And like I said, as is probably obvious from having the amazing Ashley, we all learned from each other, and the collaboration across our schools has been amazing. There are intervisitations and big group gatherings, and we have role-alike conversations at our giant convenings, which feel almost like parties or like receptions of some kind because everyone's so happy to be together. So like all the science teachers can dig into an issue or problem together, or all the principals can think about how we can support anti-racist approaches in our schools. It's been a really powerful community and still is.
And I have 2 more questions, mainly because I loved your answers when we did the prep work on this one. So the 2 questions we'll sort of move towards closing this down with, and I invite all 3 of you to join in, is what sort of learner profiles does mastery work best with? Are we talking the AP and high achieving students? Are we talking strugglers? Who is mastery for?
I'm really glad you asked that, especially because the wonderful Staten Island Tech was the first mastery conversation, and they have a national reputation as this very, very high performing school. And so I just want to throw in here and then open it up to invite Ashley and Meg to join in. We have yet to meet a student or a school for whom mastery doesn't solve significant issues and really provide significant benefits for teachers and for learners at that school. So we have transfer schools, which are schools for overage and undercredited students that are using mastery beautifully. We have Staten Island Tech and other highly selective schools that are doing it. It works beautifully with immigrant students who are multi-language learners because they can have outcomes around language acquisition and academic content and those cross-cutting skills. So I've yet to meet a young person or a school for whom this doesn't work really well. I think it's important to have the why pretty clear, and maybe some hypothetical person who couldn't understand why to do this, it would be a problem for. But inviting the perspective of Meg and Ashley here too.
Yeah, I can jump in. My first year teaching, I taught almost entirely African-American students, and I was, a 22-year-old white woman. And it seemed immediately clear to me that what was the power dynamic there was not healthy and functional. And so switching to a system that invites revisions and that actively asks for retakes and that puts us on the same side, teacher and student, with the end goal of learning, is really different than how traditional school plays out. And that felt like, from a classroom management perspective, from a relationships with students and parents perspective, from a feeling like what I was doing in my job perspective was okay. Mastery made a lot of those things easier. And then I think on the flip side, like Joy alluded to, with Staten Island Tech, we hear from schools with really high performing or super compliant students that a lot of the times the messages we're telling them about how to succeed in school is about how to behave in school and not how to learn in school. And so in a mastery system with these outcomes, we're refocusing the end goal on the learning instead of the obeying, which is crucial. Ashley, what do you think? I would love to hear, especially if you want to weigh in on students with IEPs or that perspective.
Yeah, I think one of the beginning things that helped me understand how important mastery is I am the product of the most traditional learning structure ever. I became an expert memorizer. I don't know if that's a word, but I was really good at it. And I had all of the cards and I took all the AP courses and I memorized all of this content. Because that is how my school system taught me however many years ago. And I think mastery is really where we need to go in terms of education. It shifts you towards the skills that you need to continue being successful. And after you leave, like, I am sorry to my AP Spanish teacher, but cramming for that exam has not helped me. My study in Guatemala, where I took an immersive Spanish course, is what helped me how to learn Spanish. So it's kind of thinking that way. My entire career teaching, I have always taught the ICT blocks, and they're my favorite. And I think something that I've actually seen teaching students with IEPs is, in mastery, I am constantly asking my students to explain their thinking. Why did you make this decision? How did this come to be? And my students with IEPs have been some of the best communicators about how they got to this point, what their thinking is, and they really give me an entry point. As an algebra teacher, sometimes I would get students that others might say are on the accelerated track that just would tell me x equals 2, and like that is all they were going to tell me, and they would say the work is here, and I was like, but that, come on, give me more. And it was a real struggle to try to get that communication out. And I think that this learning helps everyone in terms of, it helps the higher level students that kind of, the students that came from maybe an accelerated branch in their middle school and came into our high school, like they were pushed to communicate their thought process. And really, in a world where we can Google everything, we need to have those critical thinking skills in order to figure out what we're Googling, if it makes sense or not.
Okay. I would like to kind of bring this to a close, and thank you all so much for your time. I think there's only really one question that I can pose that ties this particular conversation all together. And thinking about this from the lens of the educators who've joined us today, what does success look like in deploying mastery? Like, I'm going to get a little meta here. How long does it take? How do I know that my school is building mastery at mastery?
That's great. I would just say young people are talking about getting traction and feeling motivated and understanding, you know, you're hearing less like, Miss, why'd you give me this grade? And students are very invested in sharing their learning. A student at one of our schools on one of our videos says, you know, when we got a paper back, we used to compare grades, and now we compare our thoughts. That was a 13-year-old boy who said that. At another school, I heard young people talking about they get to do math upgrades at lunch if they want to. So like having students motivated enough to think that they're super lucky to go work on math during lunch, you're really like energizing the learning space quite a lot. There are also really delicious conversations about teaching and learning that happen with on a staff. So they're really deep, meaningful, like the best conversations about education you'll ever have in your life are around mastery and culturally responsive education. And I would say having an intention to dismantle inequitable systems that are just there because they've been there, and really focusing on who are the young people that you're serving and who are the families that you're serving, and are your systems and structures actually serving those young people really meaningfully and equitably, and making sure you're not just doing things because they've been done that way before or you learned that way. I'm sure you all, other folks have things to add.
I mean, I'll talk about my school's journey a bit. We started as a traditional grading school, what is 9 years ago now. And then about 3 to 4 years in, we started transitioning. What Joy said about the staff starts talking about it is so, so, so key. When we first transitioned, every teacher, we had some very general guidelines, but for the most part, teachers were left to define mastery for themselves in their classrooms, which was what was needed at the time. I don't think that there was another option outside of that. Teachers needed to live in that themselves before they could even think about going and talking about it to anyone else, right? I talked about my personal experience. I had like every Common Core standard as a skill. I didn't know up from down. Like, it was not the time to say, Ashley, go sit in a room and talk to 10 people about what this looks like school-wide. However, after that first year, there was a united goal to make it better than it was. A lot of staff members really started to cut down on their skills. Then the next year, there was starting to be these inklings of like, I would see what my neighbor was doing, be like, I really like that, right? We started seeing what other people were doing and collaborating. And now we're at a point as a school where staff-wide, we are really ready and able to look into the transferable skills that we want our students to have when they graduate, right? We're at this really magical point where we actually bring out our school's mission and vision and start to say, like, what transferable skills do we have in our classroom to get our kids up here when they graduate? And that kind of, the staff hunger to really make this experience better for the students is a really good inkling that it's gone viral, so to speak, within your school. And if you are, I saw a couple people say that they're like the one person that wants to try to do it. I would just share things, right? So I was the only person in my school to do my co-gen with my students where I got feedback. And then I just kind of in the break room would share like this new thing I learned from a student because I had that discussion, right? Those random little bits of information about how great this work was or what worked or what didn't, openly sharing risks, right? Everything does not work out. I am not going to make that promise here. And really starting to be open is the first step to getting this contagious within a school.
I love that, Ashley. I heard you continually like regrounding to the why for you, which is for students. And for a lot of our schools, it's like wanting students to have a more streamlined experience of schools instead of grappling with a million expectations in terms of behavior and grading and learning. And so shifting the conversation to student experience of learning pushes this work a long way. And as Ashley also hinted, the way we see it play out a lot is in one classroom and then a department, and then departments maybe start talking and find through lines. Another great starting point is like a portrait of a graduate, which I think is like also what Ashley was thinking about, like what do we want our students to have when they leave this school? And so that is another thing that often serves to like coalesce staff energy for this work. Thanks for the question.
I think that that's a wonderful place to stop. Joy, Ashley, Meg, I look forward to ongoing conversations and seeing if there's more that we can bring to this audience to share the practices and help people along their journey on this. I hope everybody has a great afternoon and a wonderful weekend as we head into it. Take care. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, everyone.
Turnitin is your partner in fostering original thinking and supporting authentic learning. Turnitin solutions promote academic integrity, streamline grading and feedback, and improve outcomes across educational levels and disciplines. Turnitin leverages cutting-edge technology to provide tools that deter plagiarism, deliver formative and summative feedback, and surface actionable reporting. Growing from 1 million student paper submissions in 2002 to over 1 billion, Turnitin serves over 15,000 institutions globally.